If you are members, welcome. If you are not a member, but you're interested in joining a community that is about architecture and art, literature and history, about learning and conversation and engagement, we invite you to look in becoming members. You see Tess Galen, our events coordinator, on the screen, and she is also our front office person who can help answer questions if you want to give her a call or an email after the program. And love to turn the program over now to Bruce so he can begin filling you up with wonderful information and knowledge. Welcome everybody, and welcome Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Beth. The title of today's talk is 219, the Pride and Ornament of Philadelphia. And let me just share my screen. Let's see. Hang on. Okay, are we up there?
Yes. Looks like we are.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so some of you may have heard my talk back in October, which deals with the early days of the Athenaeum, and I thought I would continue on today, but in particular to talk about the Athenaeum building here at 219 and how it came to be, and the long and circuitous route that gave us this magnificent structure. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Athenaeum, you should be aware that the simple answer about what we are is that the Athenaeum of Philadelphia is a subscription library. It is a National Historic Landmark building, and it is an independent research library with internationally recognized historic collections documenting architecture, design history, and the built environment. Much of the information that I have in this series of lectures comes from a book that Roger Moss, the former executive director of the Athenaeum, wrote in 1998 entitled Philadelphia Victorian. Not illustrated here, but also very important to this work is a book entitled John Notman, Architect, written by the late Athenaeum shareholder Constance Greif. And so shout out to both Roger and to Connie for this. Just a quick recap of what we talked about before. The very first home of the Athenaeum from 1814 to 17 was in the Anthony Findlay bookstore at the corner of 4th and Chestnut. In 1817, we moved for a short time to Nicholas Dufif's bookstore at the corner of Carpenter's Alley and Chestnut Street. And then in 1817, and for the next 30 years, the Athenaeum was located in Philosophical Hall, the home of the American Philosophical Society. For the first year, we rented one half of the first floor. We actually sublet it from Thomas Sully, who had used it as his portrait studio. Within a year, we had outgrown our space there, and so we ended up renting the entire first floor for the next 29 years. From the very beginning, if you look at our board minutes or our annual reports, every year they're talking about building a building of our own and making greater accommodations with the structure. And in 1820, the board of directors minutes said, quote, such a grand project, of course, would necessarily have to come from the public at large. If the liberality to which we appeal could be induced to place the cornerstone, it would be the ambition of the directors to raise a superstructure which, while it exhibited a pure specimen of classical elegance, would with its accumulated treasures become the pride and Ornament of Philadelphia. I highlighted that last phrase there, the pride and ornament of Philadelphia, but I also wanted to note that was a two-prong adjective in that it included not only a building of classical elegance, but also the accumulated treasures. So from the get-go, the Athenaeum was interested in our collections as well as our building and the appearance for surrounding those collections. In 1829, one of our members, Dr. William Lehman, left a $10,000 bequest. Actually, he died in 1827. We received a $10,000 bequest toward the construction of, quote from his will, an edifice of chaste and simple architecture. Chastity and simplicity seem to be recurring themes with the Athenaeum board, particularly when it comes to architecture. Those of you who have been to the Athenaeum, when you come into our main reading room, if you turn around and look up, you'll see this handsome marble memorial to Dr. Lehman for his bequest. So we acquired that in 1829 and spent the next 15 years trying to figure out how best to spend that fund on a building that would meet his testamentary requirements. As we talked about last time, beginning in 1836, there was a proposal for a joint library on the south side of Independence Square, which would have included 6 institutions that are listed here. There are drawings in the Athenaeum collection by Thomas Somerville Stewart. William Strickland was also another competitor in that competition. In 1840, there was a proposal for a joint library, not with 6 institutions, but just with 2, to build a new library building that could be used by both the Athenaeum and the Library Company at the corner of 5th and Library Street, where their building was located. So that was another attempt, another failed attempt. In 1839 and 40, there was a competition for the Athenaeum for a building at the corner of 6th and Walnut Street. This would have been a building for our own purposes, and it included some of the heavy hitters of Philadelphia architecture at the time: William Strickland, Thomas Eustace Walter, John Haviland, and John Notman appears in this as well. Again, the times were tough, and the board was hesitant about committing the funds when the economy was so tenuous. And so this is the site upon which all the buildings we've seen so far, with the exception of the one with the Library Company, would have been built. The south side of Walnut Street. This is a view from the steeple of Independence Hall, and this prime real estate had been opened up in 1835 with the demolition of the old Walnut Street jail. The reason that the economy was so bad and that our board of directors was so hesitant about investing in building had directly to do with the bank war between Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle, president of the bank. Mr. Jackson decidedly won that war, and technically, while the dates of that war are 1833 to 41, really the depths of the depression that were created by that really didn't hit Philadelphia until 1842 and 43. So it was very, very tough times to start thinking about grand building schemes. But real estate and the economy don't necessarily wait for individual investors to regain their confidence. And so by the time 1843 rolled around, this open ground, this prime real estate directly facing Independence Square, was no longer available. This is what is called Lawyers Row. It was a row of houses that was built between St. James Street, which is now on the right here, up to Walnut Street. Building is at the corner of 6th and Walnut. So in those early 1840s, this space had been built, and so that really prime real estate of the corner property for an Athenaeum building was no longer available. And so in 1843, there was a discussion with the American Philosophical Society to jointly build a building with the APS, a new building on Independence Square. They said no. And so what you have here is an idea to build a multi-institution joint building that failed. A proposal for a joint building with the library company that failed. The proposal for a joint building with the American Philosophical Society that failed. And a proposal to build an Athenaeum-only building at the corner of 6th and Walnut. And they almost went ahead with that, but the economy. So that will give them a half failure for that. But as the depression caused by the bank war gradually ended in 1843, in March, the Athenaeum board authorized the purchase of the lot at the corner of 6th and Adelphi Street. That's now called St. James Street. It's the lot where we are now located. That lot was for sale for $12,000, so the board authorized the purchase of it. But they dithered, and again, they were hesitant about investing. And so 2 years later, when they finally decided it was time to invest, that lot had already appreciated $6,000. So there was an announcement in the United States Gazette, the newspaper, announcing the purchase of this lot for $18,000. So in the spring of 1845, there was a call for drawings once again. And John Notman once again submitted a drawing, as did John Haviland, and this time Napoleon Lebrun. There also was a drawing that we don't have, we have no documentation for what it looked like, by an architect by the name of Richard Gilpin. So you might ask, well, why weren't the heavy hitters submitting entries in this particular competition in 1845? Well, Thomas Houston Walter was not in town. He had gone to Venezuela for 2 years during the depths of the Depression, where he was designing a new harbor for the Venezuelan government. And William Strickland, the great proponent of the Greek revival, had moved on to Nashville, Tennessee, where he was overseeing the design and construction of the Tennessee state capitol. So John Notman was chosen the winner by the building committee of the Athenaeum at that time. Richard Gilpin and Napoleon Lebrun were both awarded $100 for their submissions, and John Haviland proved to be the true loser. He certainly was the senior architect at the time. He only got $50, which was really put him in the also ran category. And in some ways, the Athenaeum competition sort of represents sort of the fading of his star from the Philadelphia architectural galaxy, if you will. So here is Knottman's design number 1. He would ultimately do 5 different designs for the Athenaeum building between April 1845 and July of that year. So in design number 1, we see a fairly chaste Italianate structure with 5 bays in the front and a 9-bay side elevation on Adelphi Street. Here is his design number 2, slightly modified to have a somewhat fancier entrance on what's now St. James Street. And interestingly enough, in this proposal, the main entrance to the Athenaeum building would have been through the St. James Street side, which is somewhat strange because even then that was not an open area directly across the street. So people would essentially have to walk down an alley to get to the front door, and that may be one of the reasons why the Athenaeum board decided not to go with this particular design. If you look at the lower plans, you'll see the basic outline of what the Athenaeum was all about. We had the library room here on the second floor, chest room there, and the newspaper room. Those three components were part of the program from the get-go. Notice also on the first floor there is a design for a lecture room, and that will show up again and again, and we'll talk more about that soon. Here is the Knottman design number 3. Again, refining the building, tightening up its Italianate qualities. And here you see that there's still five bays here on the front side of the building, but the 6th Street entrance is definitely the main entrance here. Then something strange happened, and we don't really know what it was, but it may be that somebody on the building committee on the board started to grumble, somebody who was used to Greek revival splendor, and said, well, you know, maybe why don't we have any columns? How about if you give us some columns, Mr. Knottman? And so, as most architects, he followed their lead and made a suggestion. And this drawing, which actually is owned by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, shows a very, very different building. It's a marble facade, but very heavy columns. My personal opinion is that this is something that Knottman may have done just to illustrate A, the additional cost that would entail, and B, to illustrate the clunkiness and the sort of the extravagance of the design, and again, it'd be very hard to call this a simple structure. So design number 4 was done. In fact, there were floor plans and sections that we have in the collection for it as well, but it did not get anywhere either. So by July of 1845, Knottman, working closely with the building committee, and in particular their chairman, John Montgomery, prepares a set of designs that would ultimately be accepted by the board of directors. In this drawing on the left, you see here a very plain elevation. The first 4 designs had been for marble facades, and the estimate for the initial design for this building was also for a marble facade, and Knottman came in with an estimate of $27,000, and the board said, no, you can only spend $24,000. How did they come up with that figure? Because that was exactly the amount that the Lehman bequest had grown to. From that $10,000 bequest had grown from $10,000 to $24,000, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't spend a penny more on the building. So what you see is that Knottman is whittling away a number of things, and the easiest way to save money was to substitute a brownstone facade for the marble. So we see here both a rough front elevation, longitudinal section, and then a transverse section. And again, you see that lecture hall in the rear of the first floor. If those of you who are familiar with the Athenaeum will recognize the newsroom here, the grand stair right in the center, and then the decorated columns with the gallery above. Here's a closer look at that as part of design number 5, and a detail of the elevation. So here we have Knottman's designs and 6 months of his work of working closely with the Athenaeum, and then the ultimate perspective view, which was lithographed and reproduced in engravings thousands of times, both by the Athenaeum and by others. So the cornerstone of the new building was laid on November 1st, 1845. The building opened on October 18th, 1847. And you'll notice there is an opening ticket, a ladies' ticket for the opening of the new hall. Women were not permitted to be members of the Athenaeum yet. It wouldn't be till 1855 that the Athenaeum had its first female shareholder, but they were inviting ladies to come to the party. The Athenaeum building costs, the land was $18,000. The building was 24,840 and change, and the total being about $42,000. A relatively inexpensive building for its size, its location, and its purpose. So while the building was under construction, we looked at the costs there, but the costs were human as well as financial. On November 19th of 1846, the Public Ledger had an article entitled "A Disastrous Accident," and it read, quote, "About 2:30 yesterday afternoon, a dreadful event occurred at the rear of the new Athenaeum building, corner of 6th and Adelphi Street. A scaffolding had been placed on the eastern wall at an elevation of about 60 feet from the ground to enable the carpenters to work at the large cornice which is to surmount the building. This scaffolding was supported by pieces of scantling called outlookers, quote unquote, from spaces left in the brickwork for that purpose. So they actually had, as they built the building, they had spaces where they could tie in the scaffolding. 6 carpenters were engaged at work near the southeast corner of the building. That's at the rear of the building. And about 500 feet of lumber for the cornice was placed upon the scaffold when the outlooker nearest the corner suddenly broke off close to the wall. And of the 4 carpenters upon the portion of the scaffold at the time, 2 were precipitated to the ground and almost covered by the pieces of scantling and other materials which fell along with them. So in great 19th century prose, they were precipitated to the ground, which they fell 60 feet from the roof level of the Athenaeum onto the ground. And then worse yet, the lumber that was on the ground, on the scaffolding, fell on top of them. Richard O'Donnell and Robert Murray were rushed to nearby Pennsylvania Hospital, where Mr. O'Donnell died from his multiple injuries. Murray suffered a broken left leg and was, quote, otherwise dreadfully lacerated and bruised, his face awfully crushed by the striking against the corner of a brick of marble lying on the ground, and a great mass of materials falling upon him inflicted a great number of injuries. John MacArthur, and that's John MacArthur Jr.'s uncle, the City Hall John MacArthur. John MacArthur the elder was the chief contractor for this building, had been hired by Knottman. John MacArthur and Morris Nevin were both miraculously preserved by being able to grasp onto the outlookers with their hands, and they remained in this perilous situation, dangling in the air, until hauled up by others of the workmen who came to their aid almost immediately. So 2 of the workmen, including the chief of the works, were literally hanging off of the edge of the building, and they were saved. One died, the other one was seriously injured. So it was dangerous work, and of course there were no OSHA rules back then, and it was not a simple thing to do, particularly when you're dealing with the heights. But that wasn't the end of the story, because just 6 weeks later, again in the Public Ledger, this time on Christmas Eve of 1846, an article entitled "A Dreadful Fall and a Fortunate Escape." And it said, Morris Nevin, a carpenter employed at the new Athenaeum about 11 o'clock yesterday, fell from a ladder in the interior of the building, a distance of about 40 feet. He was considerably stunned and much bruised about the leg, but no bones were broken. And considering the nature of the fall, his escape is considered very fortunate. Nevin was one of 2 men who saved themselves by clinging on the outlooker at the time that the scaffolding fell from the exterior of the same building last November. And so here's a man who managed to hang on in that first accident and was saved, and ended up falling 40 feet here inside the building. And I can only imagine that had to have been in the grand stair, because there wouldn't have been any other space in the building that had a 40-foot clearance. Whether he came back to work or not, or decided not to tempt fate, we don't know. So let's talk a little bit now about John Notman, who he was, and how it was he came to this particular commission. Notman was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1810, and as a teenager, he enrolled in the brand new Royal Scottish Academy, which was designed by William Henry Playfair. And it was at that time, as he was finishing his schooling, that he actually apprenticed to Playfair. Any of you who have been to Edinburgh will recognize some of Playfair's buildings. He designed the Scottish Academy, but on the top of Calton Hill, which is that wonderful sort of Parthenon in Edinburgh, he actually was designing several of the monuments up there, including what was to have been a scale replica of the Parthenon, of which only the first portico was finished. So Playfair took Knottman on as an apprentice carpenter, and we know that he was not just a day laborer, because Playfair used him in the restoration of a castle further north in Scotland, and also bore the expense of sending him to a country house that he was designing in Northern Ireland as well. So Playfair was one of the most important of the architects in Scotland at the time, and so Knottman had a very excellent introduction to the world of architecture, and he certainly, you can tell from the look of that building, was immersed in the Greek revival as the rest of the Western world was at the time. Knottman comes to Philadelphia in 1831 at the age of 21. He's listed as a carpenter for the next 10 years, but with so much more. And is so often the case with successful architects, he early on makes good connections. And one of those was with a man named John J. Smith, who, interestingly enough, happened to be the librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia. But was a real polymath, because he also founded the first rural cemetery in Philadelphia, only the second one in the nation. And he was also a printer and publisher. And he also was a promoter of new technologies in terms of lithography, and created what was called the anastatic process. Smith's work actually made the distribution of prints and lithographs of architectural drawings much greater. So it was a natural connection. Knottman won the commission to design the Laurel Hill Cemetery in 1834. In 1839, he designs Riverside, which was the home of Reverend George Washington Doane in Burlington, New Jersey. It was the first residential use of the Italianate style in America. And here again, he made an important connection, because his designs get picked up by Andrew Jackson Downing, who begins to promote and publish them in his works on landscape architecture and the picturesque, and the villages and cottages. In the same year that the Athenaeum is opened, Knottman does two other important buildings. One is the Bank of North America, now demolished, over at the 331 Chestnut Street, also done clearly in the Italianate style. And St. Mark's Church on Locust Street, the great Episcopal church, which opens in 1847. And you see here that he was not afraid of the Gothic. This is one of the few churches that I'm aware of in Philadelphia, where the steeple itself is made of stone, and that takes some incredibly skillful masonry to be able to prepare that kind of joinery. And when I visited Edinburgh a couple of decades ago, I was amazed to see how many of the churches had steeples that were completely stone. Knottman's own home was by his own design. It was at the corner. It was at 1430 Spruce Street, also built in that period, 1839 to 1840, around the time that he would have entered that first Athenaeum competition. This view is from around 1920. Knottman's house and the others in this row survived until the early 1990s, when they were demolished to make way for the Kimmel Center for the Performing Arts. So I wanted to mention the architectural genealogy that was really transatlantic, and this is kind of a fun game for nerdy architectural historians to play. So if you think of apprentices and people who learn from professionals as joints in a genealogical chain, we have William Playfair of Edinburgh and John Notman. And then his people who worked in his office included John MacArthur Jr., the one who designed City Hall. In MacArthur's office was Edward Collins for a time and Willis G. Hale. And then also in Knottman's office was James H. Windram, James Hamilton Windram, the elder. His firm was taken over by John Torrey Windram, the son. Windram hired John Harbison, and Harbison associated first with Paul Cray and then left the firm of H2L2. Another important Philadelphia architect that worked for John Notman was George W. Hewitt. And Hewitt gave Horace Trumbauer a job, and of course Horace Trumbauer passed it on to Julian Abel. So you see these kinds of connections that you might not automatically think of if you're thinking of H2L2 and William Playfair, or even somebody with a flamboyant late 19th century style of a Willis G. Hale. So there's an impact and a central role that Knottman plays in that. The role that he played with Hewitt was even more important in terms of documents and as the archivist for the collection. Knottman died in 1866 and left all of his drawings to George W. Hewitt, who was his partner by that time. Hewitt was one of the founders of the local chapter of the AIA. And gave Knottman's drawings, there were about 90 sheets of his drawings, gave them to the AIA, where they bounced around town for the better part of a century. And in 1986, the Athenaeum was given the Knottman collection with the rest of the AIA collection, and those are now here, including some drawings for the Athenaeum that we didn't have. So it's a great connection and a passing of the torch, not just in terms of designs, but in terms of documents. So where did he get the idea for the Italianate, and what was his inspiration for the Athenaeum in particular? And that takes us back to the United Kingdom. And to Sir Charles Barry, who during this time when Knottman is starting his career in Philadelphia, takes on some fairly major projects in the UK. If Knottman thought he was having trouble with the Athenaeum Building Committee, it didn't compare at all with what Sir Charles Barry had to deal with the Houses of Parliament. The House of Commons and the House of Lords acted as a whole as a building committee, and you can imagine what it's like to have to deal with a building committee that numbers in the hundreds and where the people change every 2 to 3 years, and all have their own overinflated ideas of their wisdom about both building and engineering. But on the brighter side, not only was he doing government buildings, but he was doing small country houses, which I understand that this Highclere Castle was used as the backdrop for a certain PBS show. Not all of Barry's things were quite so grand. In 1838, he designs the Manchester Athenaeum, and this shows a building that has some of the elements that would appear here in Philadelphia, but more directly closely related to the Athenaeum are these buildings, and they're on Pall Mall in London. both designed by Barry. On the left is the Travelers Club, which was completed in 1832, begun in 1829. And on the right is the Reform Club, completed in 1841. By the way, this photograph here was taken by George Vaux X, the late Athenaeum director. And so these buildings actually relate more closely to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia in terms of their design. Here's a view taken from across the street that shows the two of them together. And we found in the collection an extremely a one-of-a-kind photograph that shows the north facade of the Athenaeum. It was taken during the construction of the first Penn Mutual building in the year 1913. Never, actually, only for a couple of months was this space available to capture the entire north flank of the building. But when you compare this to the two facades of the Travelers Club on the left and the Reform Club on the right, you can see where Knottman was getting some of his ideas, or potentially getting some of his ideas. Now, since the Reform Club was under construction as early as 1829, it is possible that he saw it before it was completed when he came to America in 1831. But certainly he would have been able to see it through publications as well. And the same thing is true of the Reform Club. If you look at the Reform Club on the right, you'll notice that the fenestration is exactly the same. So we have a 9-bay facade. In this case, the principal facade is on the flank, on the flank side, and in particular, the treatment of the windows on the first floor in Barry's design are very similar to the windows on our second floor, with the restrained hoods over them. And then the windows on the third floor look almost exactly like the Athenaeum's windows. And so there's a real connection there as well. So what did people think of the new building? Well, the assessment of the new building by the architect is that it is an excellent specimen of the Italian style of architecture, treated with spirit and taste. It is. There we go. It has a bold and imposing appearance from the simplicity and unity of the design, and a perfect expression of its purpose. And though astylar, without columns, the beautiful proportions of its parts, the fine details, and the massive crowning corners give it an air of stateliness and grandeur most impressive as a piece of street architecture. And that term street architecture, we tend to toss around a lot in the late 20th and early 21st century. But I was impressed that somebody of Knottman's time period was using that term, and certainly thinking of those terms. So that's what the architect himself said about the Athenaeum building. Okay, and so an assessment of the new building by the Philadelphia Press. The Public Ledger in August of 1847, as the Athenaeum neared completion, said, though the general introduction of brownstone would give a somber appearance to our city, yet as the Athenaeum occupies a position in the center of a square, the buildings on which it are entirely of brick and marble fronts, a pretty effect is accomplished by the contrast. Like a staid Quaker maiden amid a ground of gaily dressed damsels, the perfect taste and modesty of her mud-colored attire attracts more admiration than if the whole were clad in the same garb. So that's kind of a backhanded compliment, that the mud-colored attire makes the building stand out from its red and white tartish maidens that were surrounding the square. So that's what the press had to say. And there we go. The assessment of the new building by academics, again, by great good fortune. In 1848, the history of architecture from the earliest times was published by a Philadelphia publisher. The interesting thing about this, it was written by Mrs. Louisa C. Tuthill. It was the first architectural history that was written by a woman. And she's looking at Europe and the United States from the very beginning of time, if you will. And when she got to Philadelphia, she she illustrated only two buildings, which were finished just within weeks of one another. The Athenaeum up there on the left in one of those lithographs, and the Girard College for Orphans, which is completed in November of 1847. And so from the get-go, the Athenaeum takes its place in the canon of not just American, but of world architecture. The other thing that it represents here, and Mrs. Tuthill may have been thinking about this when she decided to illustrate these, is again the shift away from the Greek revival. The Athenaeum, with its cost of $42,000, compared to a $2 million building budget at Girard College. And to really put it into perspective, the Athenaeum cost the same as 1.5 of these columns on Founders Hall. So the Italianate was seen as an economical alternative to the purest form of Greek revival, in that you can have a lot of the classical bells and whistles and not break the bank, literally. So at the assessment of the new building by the architectural profession. And here in 1854, someone had written to Thomas Eustace Walter asking him to recommend an architect in Philadelphia. And he said, "You wish me to recommend someone to you in whose taste I have confidence. My own impression is that Mr. Knottman, Spruce Above Broad," he gives his address, "is the best architect in Philadelphia. I'm not personally acquainted with him, but his works as the Athenaeum, St. Mark's Church, and others that I have seen indicate his taste, genius, and practical skill. And there's no greater compliment for an architect than to be recommended by another architect." The assessment of the new building by the Athenaeum membership. And here we have our great 19th century curmudgeon, who rarely had kind things to say about anything or anyone, Sidney George Fisher, who was an Athenaeum member. And his diary entry from December 12th of 1847 reads thus. The building had been open for just about a month at that time. "I usually pass an hour or two a day at the Athenaeum, looking over newspapers, reviews, and magazines. It has been moved to the new building erected by the company on 6th Street, opposite Washington Square. The handsomest edifice in the city, in my opinion. A more quiet and agreeable place for lounging reading one could not have." And then he goes on to describe the building somewhat incorrectly. The lower story is used for offices, etc. Oops. The second is occupied by the Athenaeum reading rooms, and the fourth by lecture rooms. Well, the Athenaeum doesn't have a fourth story, and we didn't have a lecture room on the fourth floor or on the first floor. The lecture room they decided to ditch because they signed a long-term contract with the Philadelphia School Board to use that space. Those used by members are three: one for magazines, reviews, and books, one for newspapers, and in between them, a small room for chess. The two reading rooms are very large with lofty ceilings, beautifully finished and proportioned, well carpeted, most comfortably furnished with convenient tables and easy chairs, and heated by flues and lighted by gas. But not everyone was happy, and rarely is everyone happy, particularly when it comes to architecture. On the day of the grand inauguration, an unknown Athenaeum member who wrote in his diary went to the inauguration of the new Athenaeum library. Of the new Athenaeum. The library was crowded, and T.I. Wharton, who was the president of the board at the time, T.I. Wharton delivered delivered a poor oration full as usual of bombast, little Pedlingtonisms, and if you can find out what the word Pedlingtonism is, I'd very much appreciate it. Full of Pedlingtonisms, conceit. All the elegance by no means reconciles me to the change. My only comfort is that when we shall carry old McElhenney, he was the librarian of the Athenaeum, pictured here, when we shall carry old McElhenney and the steady habitués with us to our new home. Though the former, sorry, oops, though the former will almost lose himself in losing that old nook at the APS, littered with loose literature, when he emerges spectacles in hand to answer an inquiry. And the chess habitués will, at least for a time, play much worse away from their snug and crowded corner. So you can't please everybody, even for $42,000. So the next time that I come before you, we're going to talk about 219 and the long 19th century, and talk about more about what went on inside the building and how the institution survived and then prospered in that time period. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I think we've had some questions, and maybe if somebody knows what a Pedlington is, they will let us know. We've got them both in the chat and in the Q&A. So let me see. Here, one question is wondering why the APS and library company declined to join the Athenaeum in the building project.
Well, I'm not sure about the APS, but I have a feeling that they didn't think that we were putting up enough money from the APS's account. With the library company, we know that there was at least one cultural difference, one institutional cultural difference. The library company allowed women members. And they not only allowed women members, they allowed their women members to roam freely in the stacks. And apparently this really bothered the Athenaeum board of directors, that was unseemly at the best and immoral at the worst.
All right, so that says a little bit about us and our history. Stephen is curious, wondering if you could elaborate more on the usage of, quote, street architecture. Does it merely mean a building that's not a freestanding structure? It sounds perhaps akin to how we might describe a building today being contextual or conversant with its neighbors.
I don't mean to say that 19th century architects were not aware of context. And I have a feeling that Knottman was very sorry that the Athenaeum did not buy the corner at 6th and Walnut when they had the chance, because it's a much more prominent corner. But I think what he did was that he understood that slipping an extraordinarily elegant building into an already established row of buildings, and I had mentioned Lawyers Row. The two buildings that were to the south of us were already there. They were built in the late 1830s as well. They were 4-story buildings, the same height as the Athenaeum. So we were tucked in, and he did the very best that he could, and I think much better than we might have expected. Coming off of the Greek Revival, where you have buildings, I like to say that shouted at the street. And if you compare this to, the Second Bank of the United States around the corner, there's a building, whether you know anything about the bank or not, when you walk past that is a building that beats its chest and says, I'm an important building, important things happen here. The Athenaeum embraced the Italianate, and it barely whispers at the street. And that's one of the wonderful things about it. And so many people walk past the Athenaeum assuming that it's a residence. In fact, the most common question I'm asked when I give tours of the building of first timers is, whose house was this? So it reads residential from the outside, but what happens on the inside, particularly on the second floor, which were the Athenaeum rooms, it just really explodes in both scale and light and color in a very, very unexpected way. That was one of the hallmarks of the Athenaeum. Despite the fact that we're sort of tucked into a row, one of the advantages of the 6th and St. James location is that we do get light from 3 sides. Even when the skyscraper went up across the street in 1914 at Penn Mutual, thank goodness they had a limestone cladding on the outside, and that bounces much reflected light into the Athenaeum windows.
Sarah McDonald has enlightened us all. Thank you, Bruce. Pedlington was a fictional village created by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Pedlingtonism is synonymous with quackery, cant, and humbug. If anybody wants to go through that, Tim Hollis shared with all panelists and attendees, we'll look from archive.com about a story about a London resident who visits a small town in the country from the 1860s. So that might help us also understand how they understood Pedlingtonism. So one of our guest attending wanted to know what accounts for the strip of stucco outcropping on the right side of the building just beyond the coins. Does it throw off the symmetry of the building?
It does disrupt the symmetry of the building, and for a long time I thought that it had to do with the placement of both the fire tower and plumbing systems into the building. It has nothing to do with that. It actually was there from the beginning, and it had to do with the fact that we were built against the party wall of those 2 Regency style gable roofed houses that were immediately to the south, without that additional setback, there was no way for Knottman to show off the coining on the corner of the building. It wouldn't have made sense to have that brownstone coining directly adjacent to the brick Regency style houses that were there, and so it was essentially a setback to show off the facade of the Athenaeum, because there wasn't a whole lot of facade to go around, and that sets it off. But yeah, that's always that always made me wonder as well. But if you look very
Jim has
closely
a fun question here
plans,
about the pronunciation of the 3rd syllable of the Athenaeum. He said he started rhyming with bay as I said it, and they noticed that you're pronouncing it as rhyming with me, Athenaeum. I'm wondering if there's a disagreement.
I think it's a potato issue. And I think it all depends on, if you say archaeology or archaeology. But from what I understand, there are 3 pronunciations that are correct: Athenaeum, Athenaeum, or the Brits seem to prefer Athenium. So one that is definitely not correct is Athenaeum. We hear that where it starts like the name Anthony, and that's not correct. It's a tempest in a teapot. So it's that elided A and E. So Athenaeum, Athenaeum, potato.
That's great. We hear that a lot. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see the multiple pronunciations, not Athenaeum. There's no N there, but yes. So Stephen notes that in addition to the coining, it also allows the cornice to turn back fully into the building rather than being cut off.
Exactly. Was that Stephen Howard?
Yes.
Hi, Stephen.
Yes. So David is wondering how the rooms on the upper floor were originally used.
Well, I'll get into this more in the next in my next talk. But the Athenaeum Board of Directors wanted 2 things. They wanted a building that didn't cost more than $24,000, and I think that change beyond that included some of the furniture. So they had that money from the Lehman Fund, and that's what they were going to spend and no more. But they also were sensitive that they wanted to have a building that would help pay for itself in perpetuity. And so the third floor and the first floor were rented out as office space. The two biggest tenant or two most prominent tenants that we had at the time of our opening, on the first floor, the entire rear of the first floor, where the lecture hall would have been, was rented out to the comptrollers of the Philadelphia Board of Education. And that was actually a pretty good deal, because the school board was here for a good 35 years. And so that was steady income that was happening. In the first year of rents, and not all of the rooms were rented. The board of directors minutes indicated that there was $2,000 a year income from the rents. The other major tenant in 1847, and they were actually here through the early 1870s, was the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So on the third floor in our west room, directly above the newsroom, the Historical Society had their rooms there. But in my next talk, I'll talk about a number of the other tenants, and we've had tenants. We had tenants in the building as late as the year 2000. The last tenant to leave was the Victorian Society in America, which had their national headquarters here for for about 30 years.
So this is fun. So Joe would love to find out who the human figure on the Athenaeum seal is. It's actually not a human. You want to tell Bruce?
A divine figure, you might say. There is an entire section of one of the histories of the Athenaeum that talks about the design of the seal. And so I don't want to say something incorrect. The seal itself was designed by one of our board members, Pierre Duponceau, and so let me find out more about that. Feel free to email me, and I'll be able to get you the correct answer. I don't want to spread misinformation.
We know at least it's Athena, the goddess of wisdom and of war. At least the idea of an Athenaeum as a place to worship Athena. So a place of wisdom, which is where what the Athenaeum has always been, is a place for general knowledge, learning, ability to access books and other collections to learn about our world. Thank you. I think your one final question, were there larger cultural currents, either social or perhaps just within the design world, feeding the tide pool architectural values of chastity and simplicity?
Those terms, I've done a lot of research on Girard College for Orphans, our sort of fellow institution, although much better endowed. The head of the building committee at Girard was Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States and board member of the Athenaeum. When Biddle was involved in convincing, and it didn't take much convincing Thomas Eustace Walter to change his winning competition entry into a full Greek peristyle. Biddle said that he had an opportunity, primarily through the largesse of the Girard estate, to create, quote, a perfect chaste specimen of Grecian architecture. And so that idea of simplicity and purity was not just for the Italian, but in many ways even more so for the Greek revival. There also was a real sense that the Greeks had unlocked a secret in terms of the geometry. In terms of geometry and in terms of the proportions, and that to tap into that simple geometry and proportion was not just pleasing, but it was enriching, and that being around well-proportioned and chaste buildings made you a more moral person just by being around and using them. it seems like a very foreign concept today, but in the 1820s through the 40s, it was certainly thought that that better buildings made better people, and it goes all the way back to the Greek and to Pythagoras and the magic ratios.
So Vic is wondering if you could clarify a little bit. He heard you say that Knottman received $50 for the first prize in the original competition, and wondering why he received less than the second and third place winners.
No, Knottman won, so he didn't get any money, but he got the job. John Haviland got $50, so he essentially was the bronze medal winner, which as the senior architect must have stung quite a bit at that time. So yeah, so Knottman didn't and in those days, this competitions were fast and loose, and so many times organizations or individuals would request sets of drawings and then keep them. And then when they didn't hire certain architects, then they were just out of luck. And so it was really up to the individual institution or organization to decide, well, we'll pay you something for your effort. But it must have been a slap in the face to Haviland, who clearly spent some time. As soon as there was a newspaper account in 1843 that the Athenaeum was thinking about buying this site, John Haviland started sketching it out. His sketchbooks are at the Van Pelt Library at Penn, and he started sketching it out and estimating it. So even without any direct contact, or at least any recorded contact with the building committee here, he's already trying to grab the commission, and ultimately unsuccessfully.
So here's our final question. The building is sometimes referred to as in the Renaissance Revival style, which I know overlaps with the Italianate. Is there much difference?
I think that Renaissance Revival is a more encompassing term than Italianate. To further define it, it would be an Italianate palazzo as opposed to an Italianate villa, so Knottman is comfortable in both in both worlds. But of course, this is it refers to the Renaissance primarily in northern Italy, where this revival of some of the ancient themes in a modern setting for the 1500s. So the question is, I think it's an Athenaeum question. Whenever you have two architectural historians in a room, you have at least three opinions, and so.
Well, thank you, Bruce. This has been fantastic. I know there are lots more questions, and join us on Tuesday, February 9th at noon for the next in this series. We look at the long 19th century of the Athenaeum, 1847 to 1968. Before that, I invite you all to join us tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. To hear from Dr. Kathleen Cahill about her most recent book, Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. And you can register for that online. We look forward to seeing you all at future programs. We're so glad to have you as our members and